So here's a picture. If you look at this picture, there's President Obama in the middle. Right behind him is a short, sort of red-headed woman in a plain pink top. That's a woman named Christina Romer. She was President Obama's kind of chief economic advisor through most of his first term. Okay? So she was his first chief economic advisor, and she's a professor at Cal Berkeley. Okay? This is a picture of them, as the president signs a $26 billion bill to save local police and teachers from layoffs. So they gave the states $26 billion to cover budget shortfalls that were specifically targeted at police and teachers. Make sure police and teachers kept their jobs. Okay? Not my kind of teacher, but, K-12 teachers. Christina Romer famously said that they originally underestimated how bad the recession itself was. They didn't miss the crash part, but they just thought that the recession itself, because of the nature of the crash, that it wasn't, and they underestimated how bad the recession was going to be. And that had they gotten their forecast of what the recession was going to be like better, they would have done a different stimulus package. Okay? So we go back, remember that there are lags in policy, right? You got to recognize there's a problem, then you've got to decide what to do, and then it's got to get implemented. All of those things played a part in this 2007, 8, 9 problem. They didn't do a very good job of recognizing the problem. The plans they set up weren't really geared for the problems that existed. And then things like the road construction, where it takes 5 months, a year and a half before people are spending that money. Okay? All right. Then coupled with it, we have the whole argument about how big the multiplier is. And again, in your book, you can see a table where people are saying basically the multiplier is somewhere between 0 and 4. And really, if you tell me about someone's whatever else they've written, and you say, this person is going to do a study of the multiplier, and here's their articles on other things, and I go read their articles on other things, I can tell you how their study on the multiplier is going to come out. Nobody who's in certain schools ever does a multiplier study that comes out with a multiplier being high. They always come out with a multiplier being low. And everybody who's on the other side of the fence always comes out with the multiplier being high and never comes out with the multiplier being low. Okay? There's a problem with a lot of statistical studies, and there's people who actually are famous for pointing these things out, that the assumptions you make at the beginning of the study influence how the study turns out at the end. And if you make the quote-unquote right assumptions, you can kind of make the study flow any way you want. It's not uncommon for us to have a professor from somewhere come into campus and give a presentation to us about what they're doing, right? So we get somebody who's just going to go out in the job market, and so they'll go around to schools all over the country and they'll present a paper and try to get you to hire them and blah, blah, blah. It's not uncommon for them to start their presentation and, us old people in the back to turn to each other and go, okay, this is what the result's going to be. And they make so many assumptions up front that they lock themselves in, and they kind of guarantee the result. Okay, so let's talk about the national debt. So we have some terms that matter. Terms. One term Okay, let's talk about the national debt. We have some terms we need to understand. Term number one is the word deficit. The deficit is over a year or a month. It's over a specific period of time, a short period of time, not longer than a year. And the deficit is the difference between how much we spent and how much we took in. So if the government spent $1 billion more than it took in, we would have a $1 billion deficit. If it spends $1 trillion more than it took in, we have a $1 trillion deficit. Okay? The debt is the accumulation of all of those deficits over time. So we add up all of the deficits that happen over time. And if there's a surplus, which is the opposite of a deficit, which means the government took in more money than it spent, then we subtract those out. And over time, you end up with a debt. So if we look at our time, and we have some numbers to kind of look at this, the last president of the United States who left office without a deficit, without the budget being in deficit, was Bill Clinton. He had a budget surplus that he gave to W. Bush. The last president who left office without any national debt was Andrew Jackson in 1830-something. I'm not a big Andrew Jackson fan because of other things that he did, but paid off the national debt when he was president. Okay? There's problems with the national debt. One of those, the most obvious one, which you've already seen on that chart at the very beginning, is that we have to pay interest on it. So when we get a deficit, we have to issue bonds to pay for it. So the government sells bonds to cover the deficit, and we have to pay interest through the lifetime of those bonds. All right? Then the bonds come due. So the bonds are good for 30 days or a year or 5 years or 10 years or 30 years. They have a maturity date and they come to maturity. When they come to maturity, we have to pay off the people who we owe, right? That's what a bond is. It's a loan. So we have to pay off the bond. But what we do is sort of like paying your Visa with your MasterCard. We do something called rollover. And rollover means that we borrow new money to pay off the old money. So we sell a new bond to pay off the old bond. Okay? That works as long as there are bonds, people who want to buy your bonds. There's an old, really terrible Jane Fonda movie called Rollover, and in that movie, the foreign countries that are buying all our debt just stop. And now the U.S. can't issue debt, and there's a big crash, and people are jumping out of windows of Wall Street stuff, and it's not a very good movie. Don't go watch it. But the point of that is that we issue new debt to pay off our old debt. If the people who are buying our debt stop, then we have an issue. Okay? And the last thing we want to say on this slide is that the way to measure the national debt is not by looking at the size. People go, oh, we have $28 trillion in debt. Okay, yeah, is that bad or not? So think about it this way. If a friend of yours says, and let's say, an older friend, somebody who has a job, they're 30, 40, 50 years old, and they say, I have $200,000 in debt. Well, is that a lot or not? Well, if they make $20,000 a year, having $20,000 in debt's bad. $200,000 in debt is really bad. If they're a multi-millionaire and they make $10 million a year on Wall Street and they have a $200,000 debt, who cares? Okay? The difficulty with debt is if you don't have the income to cover it, right? When you go to buy a house, they're going to decide what house you buy by looking at your income. And based on your income, they'll decide what kind of loan you can have. All right? So what's the income of our country? Well, that's our GDP. All right? So we need to look and compare our national debt to our GDP. If we do that, at the end of World War II, the national debt was like $500 billion. And you go, oh, I'd love that. Well, back then, that was 1.5 times the size of GDP. That would be like having a $30 trillion debt now, not a $20 trillion debt. Okay? So the way to measure the deficit and the debt correctly is compare them to your income, compare them to your GDP. All right? That's what we need to do. If Spain has a national debt of $1 trillion and we have a national debt of $20 trillion, who's better or worse off? Well, what are our GDPs? Our country's a lot bigger. Our GDP's a lot bigger. So we can handle a bigger debt. How much bigger? Let's go compare things to GDP. Okay? This is the percentage increase in debt by president. I won't spend a lot of time here. but it's just one of those interesting things that people are like, wait. So if you look at Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, 2 terms in Reagan, the first Bush, then Clinton, right? Bush and then Clinton, we seem to be getting things under control, and then boom, boom, boom. And then we sort of start to get things under control again, and then boom. Okay? So we haven't had a president lately, like this goes all the way back to the 50s. President Eisenhower balanced the budget a couple times. Richard Nixon, I believe, balanced the budget once in 6 years that he was president, 5 years. Okay? It just doesn't happen very often. Right? People like us to spend money, but they don't like to pay taxes. And so you get this. All right. Here's our debt as a percent of GDP. And you can go back here into the 60s and 70s. Go back into the 60s and 70s, and you see that the GDP, or the debt as a percent of GDP is close to 30, right? So our debt's about 30% of GDP. And then starting with President Reagan, it shoots up to, like 65%. And then under Clinton, it starts to go back down again. And then we get to be, the first part of the Bush administration, and it starts to go back up, and then the recession hits and it jumps, and then it jumps for a while under Obama, and then it starts to flatten out again. And they only have it through 2019. Okay? It is currently, yeah, well, we'll see. It's over 110 right now. But the Federal Reserve database at Fed Bank of St. Louis, only up to the end of 2019. This is the annual, the surplus or deficit. So high here is this graph, high is bad. This graph, high is good. So we're running budget deficits, Reagan, and then, Clinton, it gets better. And look, the little iceberg actually pops above the ocean. And in here, we have a budget surplus. We're actually starting to pay down the national debt. We're taking in more in taxes than we're spending. Yeah. And then, we get the recession and the Gulf War. And then we start to fix it. And then recession. And then we start to make it better, and then boom. And then right now we're down here. We're at the bottom. We're at 10%-ish. Okay? Yeah. All right. So the CBO says 2020, the deficit of $3.7 trillion, which is 18.5% of GDP. Let's go back. This is minus 10. So right now, we're here, right? That's where we are. We're here. If we drew this line down, it'd be here. That's a lot, yes? Here. Okay. So this is, the red line is 2019, and the blue line is 2020. And 2020 is clearly worse than 2019. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, is expecting a 2021 deficit of $2.1 trillion and 10% of GDP. All right? And the Congressional Budget Office has, it's not put in place by either party. It's put in place jointly by the two. So their job is to try to be independent and not take one side or the other side. They're supposed to try to get us an independent look at what goes on in the world. Okay. So 2009 deficit, the worst part of the last recession, was at 9.8% of GDP, and then the next year it went back up a little bit to 6.7. So you can compare the size of the 2 years here to the size of the 2 years in 2009 and 10.